all started here. Give me just a second to finish this wonderful setup things. Because I forgot that this takes a minute. Now we will confirm that I don't echo. Seems to be good. All right. So tonight, I want to take a little bit of time just to talk a little bit about what we see in the prophets of the Old Testament regarding the Babylonian exile. Something that most of us have heard about, but something that's a little more complex as far as what it did to the faith of the Jewish people at the time and what it could mean for us now. First and foremost, it is worth speaking about the fact that this is not a complete exile. Only those people who are in the ruling classes who are among the wealthy are taken away from the country. Anybody basically who the Babylonians and Chaldeans, as they were originally known whenever they first took over, thought would be a problem. So that's your priests, your political leaders, your people with enough money and land to potentially become one of those type of people. So you basically leave behind the peasant class devoid of education. This is Babylon's basic way of doing things. They pick up, remove those people, move them to a new location, keep them together, which is different than what's happened in previous exiles with the Israelites, whenever the Assyrians took over and they were just scattered. So you basically have a Jewish community known as Tel Aviv in Babylon, and then you have the people who are still in and around Jerusalem. The life for those who are in and around Jerusalem improves some degree because in process of moving people out, Babylon chooses to redistribute all the land. So that those who are there get more land to grow food, more land to work for themselves. But by taking away people, they've taken away all those who would lead in thought or action and have taken away most of the capital and most of the trade from a country. So that means that you can leave the majority of people behind, but you don't have to worry about the potential of uprisings. So this is kind of what Babylon chooses to do. And in doing so, you have a group that is very powerful, very rich, very studied, particularly in the areas of law and religion, that are now in Babylon, that are smaller in number by far than those in Jerusalem, but who have the majority of the power and the knowledge. So we come to the beginning of the texts of this time. You can start by looking at the first part of Isaiah and then looking at where there's obviously a transition into second Isaiah within the book of Isaiah, where a new voice or a new location starts speaking. This is part of the people who are moved. Isaiah's story is very much people who move and return. Even more so is, say, the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is a priest who comes into priesthood in exile and then returns. But he's influenced a lot by a couple of different books. One being Lamentations, which is written in Jerusalem during this time, and another being the book of Jeremiah, which is also a prophet speaking to those who are behind in Jerusalem. So I want to take a look at this Jeremiah text because this is one that really starts showing that there's going to be change that happens through the exile and the return from it. So Jeremiah, talking to the majority left behind, focuses on a God who will save. Up till this point, the majority of things are a God who will protect or a God who will judge. You see it in the beginning of Isaiah, where you have the prophet talking about God will protect his temple at all costs. But whenever you get to Jeremiah, you get to this idea that that God's actual purpose is fulfilled in the destroying of the temple, and then the salvation and the return of the people. This is a significant change. That God's home becomes something that is personal within hearts and within individuals, and not just found in the temple in Jerusalem. This is also a place where we move from a practical monotheism, where generally, whenever talking about God, it is almost my God is better than your God. My God is more God than yours. Yahweh is the greatest God. Where other gods are allowed to exist, but are pretty much ignored outside of the battle between Yahweh God and any of other gods. You see this with Elijah and the prophets of Baal. You see this in other places where these gods are treated almost as if they do exist, but that they don't matter. Theoretical monotheism moves us towards a dualistic view that there's only one God and everything else is evil, and thus all these other gods are just imagined or vanities of the other people. This becomes even more interesting in the regards that Jeremiah continues to talk about the idea that, oh, well, God is the God of all nations. God is not just the God of Israel. Jeremiah really becomes the first prophet to focus on this. And looks at it from the perspective of that, well, if we're going to have salvation, salvation has to be for all. God is the God of all people. God will save all people. That this is not limited to just those who are here and around Jerusalem. And this is in part because they know that these people who have led them have gone to Babylon and are becoming indoctrinated into the Chaldean culture and later into the Persian culture. And they recognize that there is a connection of humanity between themselves and all the other people around them who are experiencing the same loss and the same grief of their leaders being taken away and their place of worship being destroyed is not a singular effect just to Jerusalem. So to sum it up, that we've gotten more towards whenever you talk about God acting, God is starting to act more with the individual than just with the nation or the people as a large sense of community, but is also acting within the individuals and within the families. Those texts being written by those in exile at the beginning starts with an idea that God is still the God of Israel. Still a practical monotheism because they're in a land where they want to say, well, yeah, you've got a God, but our God's better. And that other nations aren't under the same God, but are being used by Yahweh to pass judgment. So they still focus on the idea that we have to go back, we have to rebuild the temple, and we have to maintain the rituals that Mosaic law has put in place. They're also focused, again, the idea of family and nation as the paramount of judgment and action. It is not any one individual's actions that cause these bad things, but it must be the nation that must turn. And it also continues to focus on the correcting of ritual. The idea that we are obviously doing something wrong because God has punished us. And finally, they do, though, begin to see a role of Israel's role as missionary. it is to bring the ritual to people so that they will then come back to the place. This is how the leaders begin whenever they start having sons and daughters with those who are Chaldean and intermarrying. Go, well, this is part of our conversion of these people. This change from these first prophets to Jeremiah is striking. Again, this idea that God would never allow the temple to fall, to this idea that, oh, God is present in the destruction, that the covenant is not just with people who follow God's rules and were chosen, but a covenant with all people who keep God in their hearts. That's a huge transitional point and a huge differentiation between these two communities. This also is pointed out, Jonah is really the only book that actively connects these two views. We have a missionary being sent in Jonah to offer a version of salvation, that if you turn and change your ways, God will save you, but doesn't require people then to join the Jewish faith. This idea, though, outside of Jonah, stays pretty much outside the Jewish tradition until Jesus's ministry. So the other book that's worth looking at, and the other prophet that's really worth looking at, is Ezekiel. Because Ezekiel, in his return, is struggling to match this call that he sees from these people for personal accountability and the global worship of God with his training and experience as a priest. He brings to that forefront the rebuilding of ritual and the outward showing of faith. But it's clear that while he doesn't believe the world is ready for spirituality without the ritual, he does aim to take ritual to a place where the smallest limits are possible. To say, as much as we can open up, we need to open up. He eliminates majority of the exclusionary features in what he says is required for the temple. He brings the Levites to the forefront instead of slave labor, and he puts them side by side with the priests. This likely leads to the completion of Leviticus and much of what we know as the Torah and the priestly parts being put within that text. That, oh, we need to make sure that this ritual is understood within this context of all people. So those in exile are also, though, taking on parts of these religions around them. It's been integrated into their faith. We have lots of history that shows priests who have sons and daughters who are given names of the Chaldean gods and later the Persian gods. But many at the same time that are naming their kids these things and who are starting to adjust what they understand faith to be are also focused on writing what should and shouldn't be focused on in faith. And so while they're still writing all the things that are in Levitical law, they also start including all the things that have been mentioned by the prophets up to this point. The Elijahs and the Elishas and everyone else up to this point suddenly begets an equal footing, where social justice and reform are called to be central to God's mission. These are things that weren't part of early stage Judaism. This is a constant, yeah, there's a prophet here and they're telling us to do things, but it was in a moment in time. This is where those moments in time start to be recorded. But also, they're not just trying to purify this religion. They are attempting to return the laws and the cultic practices back to those Mosaic originals. They are working their way to find that cultic purity that comes with the establishment of Judah as a theological state by Cyrus, the emperor of Persia, who sends them back, basically to say, you are going to worship Yahweh. That is why I'm sending you home. This was normal for the Persians. Their view was that this is really where the dualistic view comes into play. Their view was that there were good forces and evil forces, and that these good and evil forces were going to come to some major global collision at some point, and it was good to be on the side of all the good people. And they viewed gods like Yahweh as good. So they sent them back. And this meant that there was somewhat of a religious state formed for the first time. In doing so, you got less tolerance for the foreign religions. You had more non-Jews being persecuted. And it became a place where Yahweh and only Yahweh was worshipped. But what was interesting is that all the things that they had learned from the Persians and the Persian elements of religion became woven within their own. This is happening side by side and at the exact same time that the idea of we need to create the correct way to worship Yahweh. So, as I mentioned, the chief among these is this dualistic universe. Hebrew belief had been that the universe is dominated only by Yahweh. The only forces that were exerting were directly human will and Yahweh on anything in the world. But then to try to make sense out of exile, they gradually started to adopt this idea that there are two diametrically opposed forces, one good and the other evil. And this takes on multiple stages. You look at Job, where Satan is listed as almost a member of God's inner circle. And you get to the idea of devil, and within our Christian faith is built out of that. And that also leads to the other major thing that they started including, which was this dualistic afterlife. Before the exile, Hebrew faith basically said that Sheol was a place to abide for a soul to abide for a brief time before completely exiting existence. So their faith was based on what you did in this world. The consequences happened whenever bad things happened. There wasn't this end all, but the Persians, in their idea that it is a global good versus evil, included what happens after death as part of that, saying that good would unite with good in some sort of eternal bliss, while the evil would reunite with evil and suffer the eternal defeat of evil. These things are merged into Jewish culture at this point, not necessarily in place of anything, but as a better understanding of what they're experiencing in life. As an example, the view of the afterlife is a powerful explanation that suffering in this life, such as the exile, still is subject to cosmic justice that can appear after one's death rather than during one's life. So their experiences are affecting how they understand their own faith. Not as much of a merging of faiths as it is coming to a different understanding of their own. So I don't want to spend much longer on the history part of this, because I do want to talk a little bit about what we can learn from it today. But here's just a quick brief overview of some of the changes that remained from the exile period and the initial return from exile. There was a deeper appreciation for God's goodness. God was not just a judge, but God was good. There was an understanding that sacrifices and holiness extended beyond the temple. This happens if you look at any type of archaeological digs and areas from this time period, you will see all these places that were worshipped at, and all the things that were sacrificed and given to those places that prior to this would either have to go to the temple or would have been considered heathen. So this also means that there is a focus on outside the physical people of God. We have started to actually look at a God that is God of the whole world and not just God of the Jewish Hebrew culture. This also brings about a renewed emphasis on social care as a commandment of God. One of the biggest things that happens upon the return is, well, what do we do with what is obviously still a class system that's unbalanced? And you see struggles with that through Jesus's time. And really, we continue with it. But it is something that really begins to be struggled with instead of accepted as the norm. And this means that we also have the focus of the battle between good and evil, where good will win. And we begin to talk about the idea of a new heaven and new earth being the right way, or God's reign being the right way. So the second part that I want to talk about is really the fact that all of these things happened then and really adjusted what faith looked like. And the adjustment was done by really two different groups that had to come back together. It is inevitable, whether we think that a time is coming or whether we want to say the time is already here, that within the Big C church, small groups have returned and are continuing to return to worship as they once did. They're taking into account the things that they've experienced in this time of limbo. But the vast majority are still connected mainly by technology due to our health concerns or due to our views that this isn't the time for this, or this is what we need right now for ourselves. Regardless of the reason, you have a vast majority that are doing things in a different way because they have to. So we start with that similarity. So what does it mean that this is going to happen? What are things that we can look at and say, well, here are where what we've learned and how we've grown in this time can come out in our faith and make our faith something we better understand and can better claim. There are lots of thoughts on that. There are lots of things that my church history teacher always talked about, fads and trends. There are lots of things that are fads that say, well, whenever we get out of this, we're gonna. And then you look back and go, well, there wasn't enough of a trend to make that realistic. So trends can still start. Other things that I don't list here tonight really can still happen. But I want to look at some trends that had started prior to our pandemic time that have continued and grown in this as potential places for us to start looking. The first one is the idea that we are moving from a tribal to an immigrant education system within the church. My favorite story comes from Roger Nicosia, who is a great speaker and Presbyterian educator, who at one time, whenever he was doing some work, said, well, what about, what are the things you notice in worship for those of you who are just joining worship for the first time? You didn't worship with your parents, or you left worship, that group of people we call nuns or duns. And he's researching them. And one of them, after a workshop, comes up to him and goes, so I have a question about a person who seems really prevalent in this town within the area of religion. I see her on every single bulletin, but I never have actually met her. And I want to know whether you know who she is. And Roger looks at him and goes, who? He goes, well, her first name is Gloria, and I don't know how to pronounce her last name. And Roger's like, Gloria Patry? And he's like, yes, that's who. She was at the Lutheran church and also at the Methodist church 2 weeks later. But she didn't get up and do anything whenever her name was in the bulletin. And Roger looks at him and goes, well, did people stand up and start singing something at that point? And he's like, yeah, but I couldn't figure out what they were singing. It wasn't listed anywhere. And so Roger sings it and goes, so this is what the Gloria Patry is. Our traditions aren't known by all our people by any stretch anymore. Things that we have assumed through years of growing in our faith in one tradition or even among a couple of traditions aren't what the majority know anymore. 2/3 of people in general aren't in the tradition they were born into. That's to say, you might have been born Baptist and now are Presbyterian, or Methodist and now are Presbyterian. Or you were Catholic and now are Methodist. whatever you may be. Most people here, I would assume, are Presbyterian now, since y'all are on our rolls. But 2/3, that's not normal. What we talk about and how we say this is what Presbyterianism is, isn't something that they fully know the same way we know it. And 20% of people in churches now have no faith background. That includes people like me who grew up in non-Christian homes. And while I got to church at an early age, it still means that I don't know the common things because I went to whatever church my friends were at. And that meant I saw Presbyterianism, Methodism, and lots of other things until I settled in seminary. We can't assume that people have these things in common, that we know that whenever we say something, that this is why we're doing it. And that's a large portion of it, is educating the why. Back to Roger's story, his why is on that story is explaining to this young adult that, so God have mercy, Lord have mercy, God have mercy. And God and glory to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost are teaching these things. It's to explain how each of these songs that we sing and do have more meaning than just the words that we say, how they're connected to Scripture, how they're connected to our tradition, and how they connect to the individual. That triangle becomes so important in not assuming that any one part of it is something that people understand. The second big thing I would say is that we have to move away from the idea that mission is an out there thing. I'm going to get into this a little bit later and what it means to not just stay where we are. But the big question I think that has existed within probably the past 30 to 50 years is, if we disappeared, what would change right where these buildings are? Is the only thing that would really change within downtown Williamsburg that there would be more parking and everyone would be happy? But also, how are we the mission field? How are we being influenced by those things that are happening outside of our walls? And one of the things that this time has brought about is a quite literal, how has our right here changed? In a town where there are so many planned communities and gated communities and assisted living facilities, what does it mean to bring church and our faith into these places and within our own even closed doors of our homes? One of the things that I've really enjoyed watching over these past couple of months as I've been kind of heading up the virtual side of connecting people is the worship spaces people have created in their homes. I've seen some beautiful ones from people here at WPC. I've seen beautiful ones from people who are friends of mine throughout this country and throughout the world, who have taken things that are home and made them holy and then put them in public places. Something that 10, 15 years ago, I couldn't have imagined ever happening. We were moving so far from faith education and faith being home life that faith had moved to the building of the church and to that location, that the idea that our mission was where we literally were living was not something that was very central in what I saw in the world. And now people have created these, I look at them and compare them to the altars in Guatemala and say, these home altars that I've seen, and go, that tradition has taken on a new life with people now who will set up for their family. Here is the cloth that we put on our table every week whenever it's time for church. Here is the Bible that we're going to open to the scriptures. Here is, like, these things that we do naturally within our worship space suddenly becoming something that's at home. And I think part of that, though, is the next piece. We've moved from this reason-filled spirituality, this idea that if we can just logic it out, we can explain it. which led to, our fights of religion versus science and other things in modernity and the postmodern transition period. But we're starting to see an embracement of the mystery of spirituality. We're starting to see awe and wonder becoming something that people are grasping onto and are yearning for. The idea that looking around and seeing how many times that references to the unbelievable things that are happening in a good way in our world equal all the awful things that we're pushed to see and hear every day. Because one of the big questions that I think that pretty much all my fellow pastors, especially those who were pastoring smaller churches whenever all this hit, was how is my church going to even survive this? And it's amazing to look at the ways that these churches and church and faith in general is thriving, even though we don't have a clue what we really should say or do. One of the hardest pieces right now is the fact that we don't know. We can take our best guess, but it might be the best of many wrong or bad possibilities. We just don't know. So living in a world of unknown and mystery has, I think, brought that back to spirituality in a much stronger form than it was coming back prior. This also, I believe, is partially due to kind of our transition of leadership. We as Presbyterians love our educated leaders. We want to make sure that they passed all their tests perfectly. But credentialed leadership is giving way to gifted leadership. It's not that the credentialed leaders aren't gifted, it's that they need to be focused in on the areas where they do share gifts, and that laity as a whole can pick up leadership even without titles. It doesn't matter whether there's a title or not. What matters is, do you have gifts and can you share them? That's a major change. And one of the things that I've seen that in is one of my good friends, really one of my former youth, let's be honest here, is currently doing CPE. And she is listed as the chaplain at the hospital she's working at because, well, student chaplain doesn't really go over well.
What's CPE?
CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education. Thank you. So she's the chaplain at the hospital, and you have to, at the end of like a period, a week, review all your experiences. And one of them that she reviewed one week, and we were talking about it prior to her review with her professors, was I went in this past week and I asked this old couple whether they wanted me to stay and pray with them or anything. And the husband, who was holding his wife's almost lifeless hand, looked at me and said, if you can help me understand this, if you can help me understand how 69 years together, I'm going to wake up tomorrow and have to do it myself. If you can help me understand why this love of my life is going away from me, you can stay. And she went, I couldn't do anything. I tried to think of a scripture. I tried to think of what I was taught in pastoral care. And all I could do was stand there and cry. And as soon as I started crying, I looked down for like what felt like a couple of minutes. And when I looked back up, the husband had pulled the chair over and said, please stay. It is that gift of being able to empathize that meant more than any part of the credentialed education. It was that ability to cry with someone that meant the difference. And that type of leadership is what is coming into focus right now. Some of the best things that I've seen created during this time have not been created by those of us who have MDivs and doctorates, but from people who just have a passion for it and are pushing themselves to say, I know there are other people who need this right now. I can't be the only one. And there's amazing things happening because of that. And we as a church have to allow those things to happen. that plays into the next one. We have been a long-term planning culture for a long time. If anything we've learned in this time, it is that we have to let go of long-term planning. It's been clear for a while. If you think of the last time you came up with a vision statement for something and how long it took, and then how outdated it was by the time that you got it active, these things are difficult to do and do well, because the world is changing, is moving very quickly. But right now, because of the mystery and the unknowable things we live in, we've had to embrace short-term visioning. We've had to vision for the moment we're in and potentially the next step we take. That idea that, the lamp unto my feet is not the lamp of the entire path. That we have to look at just what we can know and go, I'm gonna do the best I can with this. Has very much changed how we do church. Again, I look at these churches that said, we're not going to survive. And as they've adjusted and done things a different way, have found themselves more connected to faith and more connected to each other in ways that they never could have imagined. And it's amazing that, oh, well, instead of trying to think about how we're going to grow, how can we be in the place we are right now and allow that to be what grows us? That, again, these just kind of all play together. One of John's favorite talking points. We're into a world of a personal evangelism and not mass evangelism. I've heard John talk about this at least since I've been here, over and over. How do we share our faith with those who we already have a personal relationship with? And how do we build personal relationships without it being an aim at evangelizing people, but to just bring our faith and our God into the ways we already do relationships? What does it mean to have deep and meaningful conversations after we actually know who other people are? That seems kind of obvious, but it's a big change from the Church of Modernity. One of my favorite ones to talk about right now is, and I wrote something on this a week or so ago, with the advent of high-tech things, and as high-tech things become more prevalent, this goes back to high-tech in, 1500s and a printing press, but is even truer today. With high-tech comes high-touch. We desire things that involve the physical. One of the big struggles right now for churches, and particularly within the education sector, is trying to keep people connected online. When you try to do that in large groups, it is very difficult. Zoom burnout is real. But people find value in things that are hand produced and not produced by tech. That can be as simple as something cooked for them, or something that you have made with your hands, and sharing that with other people takes away the aloneness and isolation that tech can cause. I can tell you as a fact, as the person who's been pretty much on this couch for 2 months now, 3 months now, I don't know, long time now. Tech creates isolation and aloneness. I can be with people who I love and care about via Zoom every single day, but it doesn't change the fact of how disconnected I feel. We do need things that remind us of the physical connection. And in a time whenever we can't just go out and get the hugs and give the hugs we want to, what we create and how we pass those things on is huge. One of the reasons why prayer shawl ministries have taken off over the past couple of decades is because it says to people that there are actual people who care about me, not just an institution of a church. Lastly, apostleship culture is becoming real. I told you we'd come back to this idea of being sent. And this is what I mean, is that we have gone from discipleship, that people that we are going to come together and be trained together to the apostleship model of we must go. We are sent out. And so this is where personal evangelism comes into play. It's one thing to say, I want to bring you to church. It's another whole thing to say, I just want to get to know you. And in getting to know you, I hope you get to know me in a way that you get to know the God that is my God. That's a big change, to be sent out instead of wanting just to invite in. But again, we don't have a place to invite right now. We can invite them to these type of events and things that are happening, but there isn't a location. The most we can do is sit beside them and talk about what we have experienced, or share this by watching it together, or do small things like that. And that's a huge change in how the church works. And it's one that even whenever we come back together is probably still going to exist. So all of these things I'm talking about have like existed here and there for the past couple of decades. They're just coming to the forefront again, because we are kind of people in limbo, people in exile, people not with our temple, not with our people, but divided and separated from each other. So there are lots of other things that we also need to consider and look at to decide where our church and our faith are going. But again, I can't forget those places, like those individual spaces that people have published on Facebook of their home altars and where they worship on Sunday morning. And I can't forget the people who have come and asked me questions about how do I talk to my kid about death? Topics that would have been taboo just a year ago. We are able to become a more honest, a more complete, a more fully faithful people because we have now had to embrace some of the things that were already happening within our faith. It's not all that's going to change, but I do think these are places where I encourage us to look at where change is happening and to realize that we're not the first ones to do this. We're not the first ones pulled away and then have to figure out how to get back together and figure out what faith really looks like, what religion looks like, what worship looks like. So I hope this was encouraging. That ends my spiel, but I am open to questions, concerns, or other snide remarks.
Hey, this might be completely way off base, but it's something that caught my attention whenever you were talking about it, and about how the idea of afterlife really started to be developed and everything. And you talked about how this is whenever we also really started seeing the Torah come together. Yes, am I remembering that?
Yes, those things come together. Yes.
Is this also that? So then my question is this whenever the interpretation of the snake as Satan starts to, like, has that always been there? Or was that a development that came? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Other than you broke up on probably the two most important words.
Doggone it.
So whenever blank became recognized as blank.
Okay.
What were the blanks?
Oh,
when the snake became recognized as Satan.
Yes.
There are pieces of literature that predate this with that interpretation, although the majority of pieces that I looked at speak more of it as the human excuse. Was still a prominent view of that story. And so there are people who place the snake and that part of the story end with the priestly author. And so, yes and no. I think that this still predates. I think there is still an idea of evil, but evil is understood as something that is part of the human condition, not just something that is out there. So, yes, we blame the snake, but it's still our choice. Would have been the primary Hebrew view of it. Anything else that anybody wants to know?
Well, our Sunday school class has been involved in this whole discussion for about a month with the present word, the Jeremiah, and all of that. So this was really helpful. I wish I'd heard it a month ago.
I didn't know that it was needed a month ago. Probably I need to look more at what the curriculum's hitting on.
No, you don't. I'm giving you a compliment. This was great. It was very helpful.
So Kelly, is your Sunday school class meeting on Zoom?
Yes.
Yeah.
We're having great participation. Better than Sunday mornings at the church sometimes.
Yeah, it's one of the things I think that's really going to be interesting is outside of these theological points is the church is going to be a hybrid. We're going to come with a hybrid society church that is going to come out of this. And that to me is both fascinating and a little puzzling as to how certain pieces are going to work. Because it is really interesting to watch a number of our faith formation pieces being like actually larger or better attended, while other things I go, well, are you going to come on Sunday morning, or do we need to start thinking about having the big TVs that can keep Zoom on while people are together for those who can't come? When is this going to be decided? Is this going to be permanent? Is this temporary? Like, it's just interesting to think about what this is going to look like. And it just puzzles me.
Well, I'm reading a book now. It was written in 1722 by a Presbyterian named Daniel Defoe.
Oh, yeah.
About a year in the plague. And it was, I think, based on his uncle, who was in London during the 1665 plague.
Yep.
And it's interesting on a number of different levels, because there's a lot of similarities between what was experienced then when they knew nothing about bacteria or viruses or any of this. And that was a bacteria, we think. But there was a lot of spread that was by asymptomatic people. And they finally figured that out. But the church had an interesting role that they never stopped having services. And but it was a dangerous place, obviously, because of the spreading factor. But because it in London, it went slowly from one part of London to the other. And by the time it got to one side, the other side was picking back up. So, but people would go to church where they would be very, I think they tried to be careful if they could, but they were less careful there than they were going out to get food at the market and those kind of things. But it's interesting to read. If you got the time and the interest, I recommend it.
The light reading at the Macbeth household.
Yeah, I can tell.
Dan Defoe wrote Robinson Crusoe. I mean, he's a good writer.
I've read that piece. It's been a while, but it is a very interesting study, particularly in partnership with some of the scientific writings of the time, and how faith and science, back then, really the very early kickoffs of modernity, still first 200 years. And you have this, oh, well, here's religion, and the aura around you is what makes people sick, versus the oh, yeah, we can find this water pump that's really not good for you.
Well, in the same period, well, during the same plague in 1665, 66, Isaac Newton retreated to the country because he was wealthy and could do it. And that's when he came up with his theory of gravitation and the apple falling from the tree and all that. So that was the
And invented calculus and lots of things.
Yep, the running gag during this plague. How bored do you have to be to invent calculus? But yes,
By the time Defoe wrote, you mentioned they didn't know about germs and bacteria. Had they figured out the rat flea connection by the time he wrote? Because that's what was the big thing. Was
I think that was
that's how the plague was spread.
Yeah, I think they had figured out part of it, but not enough to put the pieces together.
Well, they knew that it was asymptomatic people transmitting it.
Yeah.
But that was a controversy in itself because they thought it was, well, how could I get it? I never had any contact with these people. It must be coming from the air. But, they put some rational thinking together and were able to deduce that was what was going on. But yeah. Anyway,
Yeah,
thank you. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I second Mike's recommendation, though. It is a good read.
There's another good one, Guns, Germs, and Steel. Have you read
Oh,
that,
yeah.
Mike?
Jared Diamond, yeah.
Yeah, he actually spoke at Jamestown maybe 5 or 7, 8 years ago when they were doing their lecture series that they no longer seem to do. Doris Kearns Goodwin was there and similar people. That was a fantastic lecture and a great book. We have that. Yeah.
That was talked a lot about the plague, the years of the plague, and there was a revival of the art. People were entertaining themselves. They were introspective. They were very creative, just like you're talking about with Newton. More time to develop not only the arts, but the sciences and all that. It was really fascinating, I thought.
Not a piece I researched on Babylonian Exile. It would be interesting to see if arts and science picked up too.
So that picture of the church, is that one that you took?
Yes, one I took.
So you should market it and make everyone can make a contribution to the church to get a nice picture of the church behind them.
With their Zoom background.
I've got several of them I took, so next meeting I'll move around the church.
I don't know if this is going to work. Can you all see
Yeah.
this?
That's good.
That symbol, of course, isn't Presbyterian, it's Methodist, United Methodist.
That's all good.
But it's a really neat t-shirt.
Yeah, it is.
Well, thank you, A. I think I'm gonna go and finish cooking dinner.
Yep. Thank you all for taking some time out of your night and spending an hour with me. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks,
Good
Ed.
evening, all.
Yes,
Bye, guys.
good. Thank you.
Thanks so
Everybody
much.
take
Ed.
care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.